If the New Orleans Saints were trying to prove to anybody that a rebuild wasn't needed in New Orleans, they absolutely failed. We got all that and a little bit of lagniappe for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, the New Orleans Saints drop another embarrassing game. And if they were trying to prove to anybody that a rebuild wasn't necessary in New Orleans, today was an abject failure for the organization. We'll take a look at where changes need to be made. We'll take a look at how there were no redeeming qualities in this game. And we're going to lead it all off with what the New Orleans Saints failed to do, which is prove that there's something worth building around, a nucleus worth building around here in New Orleans. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us your first listen and for being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Whether it's your first time or your next time, thank you very much for joining us, especially here for a live episode of Locked On Saints. It's going to be a quick one here today because I don't want to spend a whole half hour beating you over the head with what was another embarrassing display by the New Orleans Saints on this football field. We're going to have a fresh episode for you tomorrow morning, taking a look at a mock draft Monday, so make sure you come back for that. But let's take a look at where the New Orleans Saints are after their 25-10 loss to the Las Vegas Raiders, a game where the New Orleans Saints as a whole could have done a lot of things to be better, but did a lot of good things in the first quarter, particularly over on the offensive side. We've seen over and over again this season the conversation or the quote around the idea that it was a tale of two halves. That was true for the New Orleans Saints again on this game, especially on the offensive side of the football. On the defensive side of the football, it was bad in the first half, and then it was worse in the second half. In the first half for the offense, at least things looked good to start. Spencer Rattler started the game 11 of 13 for 146 yards and a passing touchdown. Could have had another passing touchdown later on in the game, but it ends up being erased by a holding penalty on the offensive line. Another big play ended up being erased by an offensive pass interference penalty, which didn't really feel like a penalty, if you ask me. But there were a couple of those things in the first half that the Saints just failed to build upon in the second half. No run game, penalties, self-inflicted wounds, drops on drops on drops in this game. It was just the game to where nothing, again, went right for this New Orleans Saints team. The defensive side in particular just looked completely gassed towards the point where they got to the second half. And it was not the offense's fault. It was the defense's fault for not being able to get off of the field. When it comes to a tale of two halves, you can look at the fact that the Saints on offense gained 9.7 yards per play in the first half and then followed it up with just 3.1 yards per play over on the offensive side, just over 100 yards gained in the second quarter as a whole. Again, no run game, no variation over on the offensive side of the football. You look at the penalties, the drops, the self-inflicted wounds that I mentioned. You had a touchdown that was taken away from holding. Let's talk about the missed opportunities, right? A potential touchdown. I believe it would have been a touchdown. Spencer Rattler felt some pressure from the left side, rolled over to the right side on his way out, ended up gunning a pass to Juwan Johnson over the middle of the field. He caught it and kind of rolled in. So depending upon where the officials would have decided that contact took place, would have been a touchdown, maybe down at the 1 yard line at the absolute worst, but I think it would have been a touchdown. So that was erased due to a holding penalty. Then you get a big completion over the middle early on in the game, the first incomplete pass of the game, up until a throwaway later on in the first half. But that ends up being dropped. That was a seam pass to Juwan Johnson, takes some contact from behind at the catch point, not able to hold on to the pass through the contact. Then another big completion to Juwan Johnson for 16 yards down the right sideline, going the opposite direction of where the initial touchdown might have been, or where the earlier might have been a touchdown could have been. And that one ended up resulting in an offensive pass interference penalty. Again, I looked at that play a couple times. I can't find the offensive pass interference. I put that more on the call than necessarily on the player. And then you look at a 3-and-out early on to start the game over the defensive side. You get 3-and-out right away to start the game. Good stop by the defense early on, set the tone. That ends up getting erased. Well, on a Brian Brzee third down sack, gets erased because of a Carl Granderson offsides penalty. That then turns that drive into a 17-play, multi-minute field goal drive, the first 17-play opening drive for the Las Vegas Raiders on the road since 2001, according to our good friend Drew, who does some phenomenal work with the with the stats out there. Then you get an almost sack at one point that would have ended up potentially stalling a drive. That then turns into a 97-yard touchdown drive. You have an interception that goes off the hands of a receiver. And again, for another game, the New Orleans Saints, no takeaways on the defensive side of the football. On top of all of that, Amir Abdullah, the 10-year running back that was drafted in the second round by the Detroit Lions, went to the Minnesota Vikings for a little while, now with the Las Vegas Raiders, goes over 100 yards for the first time in his career. I'm pretty sure the first time he's ever broken 90. And, of course, the New Orleans Saints, who are going up against the 32nd ranked team, the absolute worst team in the run game. And I don't care if you're talking about total rushing yards per game, those two are tied together, or rushing yards per attempt per carry. No run defense, again, for the New Orleans Saints on a day where they had both John Ridgeway and Christian Boyd, two big-bodied stuffers in the middle of the defense, inactive instead of getting an evaluation on those players. Just one of those games, man, and it was just the Saints were in a situation where what they needed to show was that there was something to build around here in New Orleans, that there was some hope, that there was some light, all those other things. There are things to build around. I think you saw that in the first quarter, but you really have to dig deep in order to find those. New Orleans Saints fans have been saying for what feels like years now that this is the team that needs to embrace a rebuild. And if their goal with this game up against the NFL's worst team, this is the second time it feels like that the Saints have lost to the worst team in the NFL, Week 9 versus the Carolina Panthers, which led to Dennis Allen being fired, and now here in Week 17 up against the Las Vegas Raiders, a 3-win team coming in, and again, the worst run offense in the NFL. If their goal in this game was to show, hey, we don't need to rebuild, still a little close, all those other things, they failed. There's no way that you can look at this game and turn around and say that this team does not need an overhaul, that this team doesn't need changes. There's a lot of players that you watch play today that won't be back next year. And the core players that did play today need better coaching. They need better systems around them. They need a better scheme around them. I'll get to just in a moment why the New Orleans Saints not only need a new head coach, but they need to figure out their defensive coordinator and probably need to figure out a new offensive coordinator next season. But I'm going to get to that here in just a little bit. I think that the New Orleans Saints, who are in a situation here to where they were needed to be able to say that they've got something to build around, failed to showcase that. And so because of that, I believe that the Saints, again, have proven, hopefully to themselves, that they need to seriously think about a major overhaul over the course of the next couple of seasons in order to get back to winning ways. Because the goal for this team has always been to be competitive. First, the conversation shifted to they wanted to be competitive in the conference as one of the better teams in the NFL. Then all of a sudden you heard that competition level change from the top of the NFL to, well, they need to compete within a bad division. They haven't been able to do that for 3-4 years now. And then now they're losing to the worst teams in the NFL. So who are you trying to compete with, and who are you convinced that you can actively compete with if you're the New Orleans Saints? I don't think that there's enough for you to be able to answer anything other than this team cannot compete as it is currently constructed. And I know that they're injured and all those other things. That's, of course, a part of the equation. There's no doubt about that. But even when this team was at its absolute healthiest, and even watching a defense that is only down 2 Week 1 starters, Paulson Debo due to injury, Marshawn Lattimore due to trade, the defense was objectively the worst part of this game for the New Orleans Saints going up against the Las Vegas Raiders. So don't tell me that it's just about injuries. That's not going to sell me on it. I think that the New Orleans Saints need to fully examine everything on this team. No one should be considered safe right away. And I think that the Saints should also be examining who is going to be making those decisions over the course of the offseason, because who makes the decisions could be just as important as the decisions themselves that are made. Coming up next, I'm going to tell you why the New Orleans Saints need to be looking at not only the head coach spot, but maybe every coordinator spot as well. We got that coming up for you next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints brought to you by friends over at Rocket Money. Have you ever been in a situation where you've wondered about those unwanted, subscribe to subscriptions that you didn't know that you had anymore, that maybe you forgot all about? Well, Rocket Money can help you out with that. It helped me out. Found a couple of subscriptions that I was paying for that I completely forgot that I was paying for. They have been awesome. And don't fool yourself. Don't play yourself. You might have them. Don't think that you don't. Check find out, make sure you can do that with Rocket Money like that. And they'll also help you out with a bunch of other stuff as well. You can set up your financial goals to help you reach them faster by putting money aside for you, so you don't have to worry about things like monthly budgeting and all that kind of stuff. Rocket Money is awesome, and they're here to help you out. Highly suggest checking them out today. Cancel all your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Just go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon to get started. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon. rocketmoney.com/lockedon. All right, family, wrapping up this quick recap episode as the New Orleans Saints drop their 11th game of the season, now 5-11, still holding strong at the 10th overall selection in the NFL draft. We told you that was going to remain the case throughout the majority of the season. Saints don't really have a lot of ability to move up in this draft class, so they need to come out here and prove some things, and that's what today was supposed to be all about, and they did not do that very well. And so now what I want to look at is where the Saints need to make adjustments. Look, we could sit here all day and we could talk about that the team is bad and that things didn't go their way, or that the injuries are piling up or piled up and impacted them. We can either come out here and be as critical as we want to be, or we can come out here and make as many excuses as we want to be. But the fact of the matter is that the product that you're watching of the New Orleans Saints right now is not equal to the product that you will see in 2025. Now, will the product in 2025 be better, considerably better, much better, or somehow worse or the same? That remains to be seen. That certainly can't be the case if you're the New Orleans Saints. You need to put a better product out on the field. You're not going to be able to sell this for another season, or some version of this, even a slightly improved version of this. And so for New Orleans, a lot of what we're seeing right now, and that we could sit here and rail against and tear apart and all this other stuff, it's going to change inherently because the New Orleans Saints are going to have a new head coach. I think that this game, unfortunately, removes Darren Rizzi from the head coach conversation, or at least puts him in the head coach conversation, keeps him in the head coach conversation, but really as a long shot instead of being a guy that would be like a favor, one of the top odds guys or something like that. I think that's fair to say. 34-0 shutout last week. Follow that up with a loss to, again, the worst team in the NFL. Losing to the worst team in the NFL at the time in Week 9, the Carolina Panthers, resulted in Dennis Allen getting fired. Losing to the worst team in the NFL here this time against the Las Vegas Raiders, it doesn't do a lot to help Darren Rizzi. That's certainly for sure. I think he's a great dude. He's an awesome leader, and he's driven a lot of buy-in from this team. He's gotten a lot of guys on the same page. He changed enough to get these guys kind of riled up and ready to go. He won more games in fewer opportunities than Dennis Allen did, playing against equally poor opposition. But these last two games, I think, they don't fully close the door, but they might close the door. They don't latch the door, right? They don't lock the door, but certainly closes the door on the opportunity for Darren Rizzi to become the long-term head coach. So for me, the thing that I'm looking at for the Saints instead is that they need changes that are going to happen because the head coach that comes in is eventually going to want those changes, right? Like, those things are going to change. They'll get the quarterback position figured out in over the course of the next couple of years. I think you're probably looking at Derek Carr and Spencer Rattler next season as the quarterbacks, and then maybe developing Spencer Rattler beyond that. One of the things that he's talked to me about in the past is that, like, and this is true for a lot of rookies, you go from your final college game, you go into draft prep, you go into the draft, and you go into off-season stuff, training camp, OTAs, all that. You don't really get a break. And so having a break this offseason might give him the opportunity to go away and work on some things, come back in 2025, which is probably what he was hoping for after the first 3 starts. But now here he is with another 3 starts before the season's going to be over, because I doubt that, unless Derek Carr is able to be back next week against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers in Tampa, we'll see. But the way that I look at it is that the Saints are probably going to be looking at both of those quarterbacks again next season, and then figuring out, do you move along with Spencer Rattler after 2025 into 2026 at some point in 2025, or do you continue to reinvest in the into the quarterback position? Got to remember, once a new head coach comes to town, that head coach might have a quarterback that they want to work with and that they want to kind of enter the conversation as the future quarterback beyond Derek Carr. And so that changes everything in terms of what we're looking at right now. The players that we're looking at and evaluating right now might not necessarily be the players that the team will have based on what their next head coach wants. You know what I mean? That kind of changes everything. So, as bad as a display as things have been here in New Orleans for this team, beating up on them too much, it kind of just ends up being like a thing you do for clicks, which is what I'm not really interested in, because not a lot of what you're seeing now is going to hold over into 2025. But the question is, what will be new in 2025 and how do they make it better? So that's what I wanted to discuss here as we close out the show. I think that the Saints need to not only look at change at head coach, they'll inherently have change at defensive coordinator as well, because remember, when they moved on from Dennis Allen, they also moved on from their top defensive play caller, their defensive architect, all that other stuff. So then the next thing that you have to look at is, what do you do with the offense? Because this offense has been conservative since week 2. It's been predictable since week 2. It has not been dialed in. They have not been able to run the ball successfully, nor has Clint Kubiak been able to find a second punch outside of the run game. So if you can't run the ball effectively, but if you can't run your offense without the run game, you're kind of in a bad position. So I think that the Saints need to be listening. If their next head coach is an offensive mind, that changes everything. Or if the next head coach says, I've got somebody that I want as my offensive coordinator, the New Orleans Saints need to be ready to listen to that. Because as exciting as the Clint Kubiak hire was, and as much as we thought that that was going to bring a lot of promise, and it did early on in the season, and again, we can sit here and talk about the injuries and how that's impacted and everything like that. There's some validity to that. But at the same time, these guys have been on the field together for multiple weeks at this point. So if you're not able to change, pivot, improve on a week-to-week basis, I don't think that that shows well for what the Saints have been able to do so far offensively. The best play that you've gotten consistently throughout the season has come from Foster Moreau. Like, he's been the best player on this New Orleans Saints offense outside of Alvin Kamara, right? Alvin Kamara, of course, wasn't on the field today, so I forgot to mention him in this. But he and Foster Moreau have been the two shining spots in terms of consistency so far this season. Rashid Shaheed when he was healthy as well. And so there are some things that you're inherently going to get back over the course of the offseason. A healthy Chris Olave next year, a healthy Rashid Shaheed next year. But when you get all that talent back, you got to make sure you have the right people that are making the right decisions, building the right scheme, and deploying that scheme appropriately during the season. I don't know that any of the trifecta of head coach, offensive coordinator, or defensive coordinator really has that right now in terms of what the New Orleans Saints are looking at. Now, a second year of Clint Kubiak might look better. Let's say the Saints go out there and hire Aaron Glenn. That improves their head coaching spot. That improves their defensive coordinator spot from where it is right now. And then maybe Clint Kubiak gets better in a second year. But if Aaron Glenn is indeed the hire, and he comes in and says, I want this guy as my offensive coordinator, whether it's Mark Brunell or whatever, right? Somebody from Detroit or something like that. Or maybe Mike McDaniels loses his job over in Miami and then is looking for an offensive coordinator spot, like whatever ends up being the right hire for that head coach. The Saints need to be listening, because I'm not convinced that they have the right decision makers when it comes to their play calling, their scheme, their system, all those other things, and especially when they lack the ability to be able to adjust without a run game. And I get that a run game is very important. We know that, but we've watched years and years and years of football here in New Orleans where the run game maybe didn't work as well as they wanted it to, but they were still able to find ways to win the football win the game by moving the football through the air. To be the lowest point of this game, and this has nothing to do with any of the players on the field, but to me, the lowest point in this game was them trying the double pass again with Cedric Wilson Jr. That felt like such a desperate attempt for a spark, felt like such a desperate attempt for something to happen for this team. For them to go back to that again felt like one of the more kind of desperate moves by this New Orleans Saints team. And what they need is not desperation, but instead what they need is reliability, dependability. And right now, it's hard to find that for this team. With so many stars hurt, with 6 offensive starters out for this game, with young players trying to rise up to the occasion, and shout out to them for doing the best that they can on the field, it just doesn't feel like the decision-making when it comes to head coach, offensive coordinator, defensive coordinator is where it needs to be. It doesn't feel like the scheme and system is supporting its talent. We're just kind of right back to where it felt like this New Orleans Saints team was at the end of last year in 2023 all over again. And because of that, the New Orleans Saints are in desperate need of revitalization. And the only way they're going to find it is through major, massive changes. Can't play scared over the course of this offseason. We appreciate you very much, as always, for being here and for making us your first listen of the day. For your second listen, make sure you go and check out Locked On NFL. They'll have you covered with all the biggest stories from around the league. Tomorrow, I have a fresh episode for you. We'll dive into some mock drafts. The New Orleans Saints are kind of pretty much where they're going to be, so we'll dive into not only one selection for each pick, but we'll look at kind of the cloud and what the types of players are that are around each of those based upon what we're seeing right now. So we'll dive into that in tomorrow's episode. Make sure you come back for Mock Draft Monday tomorrow. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me on the show. If you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else around your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing. Let me know how you're living. Let me know how you're momming them. And trust Who Dat Nation, I'll holla at you.